Good evening. I see a couple attendees already in. I'm just going to let it sit for a little bit so that way we have people coming in. Alrighty. Okay. We got some people joining us, which is fantastic to see. Okay, so since it's 5:01, I'll get started here. Good evening, everyone. My name is Christina Grev, and I am the Collections and Education Specialist at the Mining and Rollo-Jameson Museums. Today is Sunday, March 10th, and welcome to our third Winter Lyceum presentation of 2024. We have a very diverse mix of topics this year. So our next two Lyceum lectures will be over Zoom. So next Sunday on St. Patrick's Day, geologist Billy Fitzpatrick will be presenting on mapping lead zinc deposits around the Highland Mining District. Then historian Robert Humphreys has his presentation on the Welsh and Wisconsin's lead mining region. Finally, skipping over Easter Sunday on April 7th and in person at the Mining and Rollo-Jameson Museums, I will be giving a presentation on how the collections team helped to preserve our taxidermy collections and the famous boxing squirrels. We invite you to stay up to date on all of the museum programs and events by checking us out online and by following all of our social media accounts. We welcome current friends, members, and donors of the Mining and Rollo-Jameson Museums tonight. And additionally, we would like to thank our sponsors whose financial support has made this program possible. Platteville A&W, Inspiring Communities, and Park Place Senior Living. After the presentation tonight, we will have a Q&A session. So at the bottom of your screens, there is a button for you to submit your questions for our presenter. I am pleased to introduce tonight Dr. James Theler. I'm going to stop sharing this real quick. Okay. Dr. James Theler is a retired UW-La Crosse archaeologist, and he is a senior researcher associate at the Mississippi Valley Archaeology Center, professor emeritus, UWL Department of Archaeology and Anthropology, and he received his Ph.D. in anthropology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1983. So thank you for joining us tonight, Dr. Theler, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to introduce myself. I am an archaeologist. I work with archaeology that has to do with pre-European Native American sites in the Midwest. And my special area has been Wisconsin since the 1970s when I entered graduate school. And I come from a background that has to do with a specialty in human subsistence patterns, what people ate, how they lived. And I'm particularly interested in bones and shells and what they can tell us about what kind of animals are here, when they were hunted and harvested by native peoples, what it tells us about our local environment. And it's a field that's become known as zooarchaeology. I'm not sure I like that term, but I'm a zooarchaeologist is my specialty. And here you can see on the screen, the first slide, a swath of freshwater mussel shells. These happen to be from the La Crosse area. You can see they're well preserved. They're about 1,200 years old. They're well preserved. You got three-ridge mussels, and you have different species. I won't use the Latin names, but you have a fat mucket here. You have a pigtoe here. You have a fluted shell here. So they have all these interesting names and shapes, and it allows one to identify the shells. And of course, by looking at modern mussels, we can find out how much meat they might provide And we can also learn about the habitat, the water types that they were harvested in. So we can learn a lot from shells and bones. And I became interested in shells when I worked in Prairie du Chien in particularly excavations in 1978 and 1980. We excavated shell middens. And as a graduate student, it was my job to write these up, to study them as part of my doctoral dissertation. So I have a long history with freshwater mussel shells. I've become very interested in their distribution and they're used by native peoples and they're used today. So we'll proceed. This program may not be terribly linear, but if you think I've missed something, you'll find off. Now I'm going to come back to it as we go along. So freshwater mussels are in our region, we have about 50 species. There are about 300 species of freshwater mussels in the United States and Canada combined. And we have about 50 species in the upper Mississippi River and its drainages and small streams. We have kind of typical big stream species, the ones on the left here. Here's a washboard mussel on the top. We have a maple leaf here, a deer hoof. Sorry, I can't remember the common name. Three-horned warty-backs, a black sand shell, lilliput, all have names that are very characteristic shells of the upper Mississippi River that you might find in the waters of the river today. You have a different complement of shells that often occur in small streams. This is the Muguanago River on the lower left in Waukesha County, and I collected here many, many years ago, decades ago. And it had a huge abundance of freshwater mussels in relatively shallow water, and these are often smaller, physically smaller species, and of very specific kinds. These are ellipse shells and rainbow shells, slipper shells. These are shells that aren't typically found in large streams, but are typical of small streams, good quality water in small streams. So we have a lot of variation in the shells, and we have species that are found in both the same species that are found in both the small streams and large streams, but they have somewhat different forms, which are interesting for archaeologists, because sometimes you can tell where a shell comes from by its shape and form. Mussels aren't very mobile for the most part. Here I'm showing you a slide of mobile mussels. And here you see these are fat muckets. And these are crawling along because the water level's going down. They kind of live in shallow water and they're trying to make their escape before they become exposed in a droughty situation. And they become more vulnerable to muskrats, especially, and raccoons and otter, who will come in and try to feed on these mussels or will feed on them. So we do have them. We think originally, we know when surveys were done of the upper Mississippi River at the turn of the last century by fisheries biologists, they found mussel beds with hundreds of thousands of mussels, edge to edge in the bottom. And these are often very long-lived mussels. They would live 50 or more years and be literally immobile in the same spot all those years unless something moved them. I guess you could have a catastrophic flood or an aggressive muskrat or humans who might move them, but they were pretty much in place, and they often built their mussel beds, as they're called, on top of other mussel shells. So we have areas that are well-watered and good currents along the streams. They had high densities of freshwater mussels, which are just incredibly abundant. A little bit about freshwater mussel sex, reproduction. Male mussels upstream deposits sperm in the water. It fertilizes the female, which is downstream. They have intake siphons and exit siphons. They're filter breeders and filter feeders. They feed on microorganisms and organic material. and things go through the water stream. The female becomes fertilized by the male, and she will spend a period, it varies, but 3 weeks, 4 weeks, developing young in her brood pouch. And these young are referred to as glaucadia. These are mussels to be, these are the larvae to be, and these are glaucadia over here. These are magnified 125 times here, so these are tiny specks. And they have little claws, teeth on them, and they open up. They have these claws and teeth, and their objective is to get hooked onto a fish in most cases. Here it shows a bluegill, although it certainly varies. And these mussels, these baby mussels to be, will be on a fish, get in a gill or the fin of a fish, burrow in and hang on there for maybe 3 or 4 weeks and develop, and finally drop off as tiny mussels, hopefully in a good environment. They are very often host specific, so certain mussel species will only take to a certain species of fish. So there is a symbiotic relationship often between a particular mussel species and a particular fish species. We'll mention this more later. We talk about the ebony shell mussel, which is now gone from the upper Mississippi River. It's only had one host, the skipjack herring, which is now gone because they built a dam at Keokuk, Iowa, 1917, cut off this fish. Happens to be migratory. It was up and down the river, and it couldn't get back up the river, and the populations died off, and we lost our most common, probably, mussel in pre-European times, the ebony shell mussel. Just want to tell you how interesting these is. So females have these brood pouches full of these little glaucadias, and they need to find a fish for them. And they have a remarkable adaptation. They produce, at least in some groups, they produce part of their soft tissue, their mantle. They're here, so they're down in the substrate. They put up this mantle. It looks like a minnow. They even have eye spots. I've actually seen this on the Mississippi River when I was wading one time, and I said, "Look at that minnow." And I went and touched it, and it wasn't a minnow. It was a freshwater mussel. And what happens is the fish comes along and they grab the minnow, and that female extrudes hundreds of these little glaucadia. They go in the fish's mouth and fins and gills, and they get in there and they burrow in and spend the next 3 or 4 weeks hunker down, using the resources of the fish to develop and hopefully drop off in a good habitat and become really baby mussels working their way to being adult mussels. It's a remarkable sequence they go through. Not all species have this, but this group, they call the Lampsilidae, the lamp shells, often have this mantle that attracts fish to bite and get infected. Interestingly, some fish, once they're infected, won't be infected again or very little. They develop a resistance to infection. I guess if you have 300 or 400 glaucadia on you, you can't do that all the time and have a healthy lifestyle. Archaeology, that's what I do. And this is an excavation near Prairie du Chien at Mill Coulee and Prairie du Chien back almost 45 years ago now. And we find these pits with hundreds and thousands of freshwater mussels. And, I just love these because you can take these and clean these and identify them. We have maybe 50 species in the upper Mississippi River, but only 15 or 20 are very common at any one time and place. And usually 2 or 3 species make up the majority. I take these back to the lab and clean them and analyze them, and I can get kind of a profile of what the water looked like, what the species composition was 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. It's kind of neat to do that. Wildlife biologists are interested in this because they want to know what was here before Europeans came. Europeans come, and what do? Well, we log, we mine, we cultivate, and the sediment in the streams, as we know years ago, we were not very careful what we put in our streams. and we damage mussel populations quite dramatically in many areas. So archaeology is important. This is a pit that was probably used for something else, and then the Native American peoples, and this is about, I think this site's about 1,500 years old, filled it with freshwater mussels, a lot of mussels on this site. They filled this pit with mussels, and it's a nice preservation system where shells preserve very well. This is in Mill Coulee. This is on the main stem of the Mississippi River, a completely different site. And you can see this lens of shell. We find lens after lens of shell. And here's another pit filled with beautiful mussels, beautiful to me. And I analyzed every single one of these as part of my graduate work. Here's part of another midden that's now gone. Interestingly, not shown here, but often adjacent to these, it took us a while to realize this. We would find fireplaces next to these shells, middens. Middens are just deposits of debris. We would find fire pits, fire areas with lots of charcoal next to these. And I finally realized they were steaming mussels out on these. To open a freshwater mussel, if you get a freshwater mussel, and you not allowed to collect freshwater mussels today in Wisconsin unless you have a permit. But if you take a freshwater mussel and try to open it with a knife, they close up very tight. And you try to open it with a knife, it is not easy with a modern steel knife. So how do you get them open? Put a little steam on them, get a nice fire charcoal, put in vegetation, get that steam rolling and throw in the mussels. It's a New England clam bake situation is what they were doing. And they were extracting mussel meats. Wanted to show you dried mussel meats. Yum. We think that many times in the past when resources got scarce, Native peoples along the Mississippi River harvested large numbers, tens and hundreds of thousands of mussels. And they would steam these open, and we hypothesize, we think they were drying these for winter resource. You can take a fresh mussel meat, these are dried, you take a fresh mussel meat and weigh it, and after you hang it and dry it for a while, it loses 85% of its weight. It becomes almost impermeable. I still have these, and these were done in the 1970s. And if you take one of these and pound them and break them up and put them in water, they become about the consistency of oatmeal. Now, I don't know if I'd want to eat that oatmeal, but that's a consistency. And if you literally take something that's nutrient poor because it has so much moisture and concentrate the nutrients, you can keep this for a winter resource. We know people did this in other parts of the world. We suspect Native American peoples did this in Western Wisconsin. Also, they made nice artifacts, sometimes out of shells. This is a shell of a species known as the pocketbook mussel because it looks like an old-fashioned pocketbook. And here's a pocketbook mussel that's been smoothed and cleaned 1,000 years ago. It has nice little serrations along the side. The edges are all ground down. This was quite a nice spoon or container when it was new. And they made nice use of some of these shells, and it's quite fun to see these. They also made scrapers or hoes out of freshwater mussels. It looks like what we call washboard, but I think this is a smaller stream three-ridge mussel from the site of Aztalan, Jefferson County, Wisconsin. This is a black sand shell, and they have a perforation here. And this perforation was allow a stick to be inserted, and you could use these I think mostly as an agricultural hoe. We find a number of these at later prehistoric sites where freshwater mussels are used as agricultural tools. I'm interested in shells because I want to know what was here in the past that we've lost. We've lost streams like the Platte River in Grant County, got polluted pretty badly during historic times and lost most of its mussel populations. This is a site called Broglie Rock Shelter in Grant County. This is me a long time ago there. And this site was excavated, not as well as we'd like, but they recovered several thousand freshwater mussel shells from here. And we find species that aren't around this area at all today. This is a so-called rainbow shell here. And this is the distribution in historic times, and this is where they are in Grant County. So we find a number of species that are not presently there, but were there in the past. So it tells us something about biogeographic distribution of animals in the past. And again, one of the reasons I work with shells is because I'm interested in such things. It's nice to put a face on what it looked like before European disruption of the environment. Because you have to admit, long ago, we weren't very nice to our freshwater environment. These are shells from the Broglie Rock Shelter, and I point these out because this is a common name is called a spike or a ladyfinger, and this is a small stream type. We call these ecophenotypes because they vary based on stream size and stream conditions. And this is a big river type. So this one was brought into Broglie from the Mississippi River. Never get a shell like this in the Platte River in prehistory, but you do get these kinds of shells. Also, you get shells that are not ever found in small streams. This is the ebony shell. This is a favorite of pearl button people. We'll talk about pearl buttons in a minute. These are ebony shells, and this is an elephant ear. These were brought in. These would not have been found in a small stream. These are occasionally, this species occasionally found in the lower Wisconsin River, but never in smaller streams to my knowledge. And again, so we can identify shells that were brought in versus shells that are local to the area, which is interesting to archaeologists and malacologists. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Probably about 1910 or 1900. You can see what they got here. They got piles and piles of freshwater mussels. I'm not sure this is Prairie du Chien or the lower Illinois River Valley, and I apologize. I don't know the origin of this slide right now. You see all these boys and gentlemen have no shoes on. This guy ain't from around there. He's got a straw hat and shoes on. I think he was having a photograph taken, but they're sorting mussels. You can see here, these are probably all, these big shells here are almost certainly washboard mussels, a common deep water mussel in the Mississippi River. There's certainly many other species there, but these are probably being opened primarily to look for freshwater pearls. Freshwater pearls started as a boom, began in 1850s in Ohio. Somebody went in the stream, I think one of the Miami rivers, and they opened some shells and they found a beautiful pearl. People started looking for pearls, and by the late 1880s and 90s, people were stripping streams and they would harvest mussels a variety of ways, and I'll talk about some of those ways. Low water, you can wait for some. There are special ways you can harvest them. And then you take and make something called a cooker. Here's a cooker. You can see it's steaming. Sometimes they would have these lined with tin, and the ones in Prairie du Chien are often lined with rocks from the wing dams. They took off the wing dams line. They would put burlap or vegetation on here and throw water on it after it got real hot, throw the mussels on, steam them open. You'd take them up on this bench, you'd search through the meats, and you might use some of the shells for pearl buttons, and you might not. It depends on the quality and kind of shell. But pearls are often were the main course in the beginning, to look for pearls. We go to Prairie du Chien, and I got so I could recognize a pearler midden from a ways off. We worked right on the river out of boats, and this is a classic pearler midden. And it looks a little different than archaeological middens come out. They have shells spreading out like this, washing out. But you get in here and you start finding broken glass from beverage bottles. I won't say whiskey, but beverage bottles. And you find other artifacts here, such as these interesting hooks. Here's one of our our measuring artifacts here, and you can see the kind of nice shape to show you. So see these hooks. These are called crowfoot hooks, and they went on something called a crowfoot bar that was drug across the bottom to capture freshwater mussels. Pearls. Wanted to mention pearls again because I know some people are very interested in them. They still, until very recently, they've closed down all mussling operations in Wisconsin. But until very recently, they searched mussels for pearls. Sometimes meats, I should say, would go back. Oops, no, I'm not going to go back. The meats might be used and fed to hogs and things like that. A lot of times they were just rotted and the animal was just killed in search of pearls or used for shells for buttons. But these are what are called baroque pearls or slug pearls. These are generally sold by weight because they were considered not too regular around. They can be very nice, like you imagine pearls to be. But this is a brooch made by Tiffany and Company over 100 years ago. And these were done with baroque pearls. And you can see they made this flower and they're very beautiful. They're lustrous. Of course, freshwater mussels are calcium carbonate, and the material is called nacre. And this nacre is lustrous and hard as can be. And as we'll know, it also made nice buttons, but it also made beautiful pearls. The ratio of pearls to number of mussels, it varies, or there are estimates done, but my experience harvesting mussels to do meat weights many years ago, get one kind of nice round pearl and maybe 100 mussels that you kill. Oops, wrong way. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Oh. Shell button industry. Shell buttons are an incredible aspect of Muscatine, Iowa, and the upper Mississippi River. All along the Mississippi River, there are shell button factories. A German named John Boppel was sent shells from the upper Midwest. Not sure if it was the Mississippi River or Illinois River. He sent shells in Germany. He was a button maker, and he made buttons out of bone, animal bones, cow bones. And they sent him shells, and he experimented with them. And he said, man, this stuff is hard and it's lustrous and beautiful when it's polished. And he showed up in America and started prospecting and ended up starting a factory at Muscatine, Iowa in 1891. And he found that you could get endless, almost endless, freshwater mussels from the Mississippi River. And he made special drills that were hollow and toothed, and they were put on a sort of a punch press or driven by belts, and you could drill out these slugs. And these then would be done by, these was generally done by men, and women generally worked very studiously to grind these down and polish these down and sort them. And these are 2 cards of Muscatine pearls. And I went to Muscatine in 1982 and 3 and harvested freshwater mussel shells from the shoreline. There were still in piles in a few areas. I imagine they're all gone now, but they were still piled by the thousands and sorted through and collected like these shells. These are ebony shell here. And again, as I mentioned before, the shell is gone from north of Keokuk, Iowa, because the fish is important to its reproduction. The skipjack herring is gone. I love these pearl button cards. There is a pearl button museum in Muscatine. I haven't been there. I've looked at it online. It looks like a delightful place for a button person to visit. And I love these shells that they got around the margins of these buttons. Somebody took 2 off, shame on them. But they got shells, but I like this card especially. Let me flip to this one. And here you can see what's called at the time a John boat. John boats were literally made out of boards and tarred every year, because I've seen them when I was a kid on the Ohio River, where I originally came from that area. I saw John boats. They didn't look very seaworthy like some of our boats today. John boats look better. I like this because it shows men working, And they have something here called a crowfoot bar. Here's somebody in the distance. And I like this because it was so exact. They show this. This guy's putting a canvas down. It's on a frame, and it's called a mule because it's done so the current will drag them down and drag them along and drag their crowfoot bar along the bottom. Ha ha! Crowfoot bar at Prairie du Chien, 1980s. Here's crowfoot hooks lined up. Remember back our shell bed, they had the rusted ones of these. These are crowfoot hooks, crowfoot bar. There's another one down here. Of course, now they're cheating. They're not pulling them up by hand. They're going to use a motor. But you put this in the river and you drift along. In the old days, they would put down their mule and let the current pull them. And then you pull them up, and here you go. You got mussels that close because they're partially open, just a quarter inch or so. The crowfoot hook hits that mussel, it closes up, they rack and pull them up. Here's a washboard, here's a 3-ridge mussel, here's a pigtail. They'll throw the ones they don't want back. And when these were taken, they mostly wanted washboards and 3-ridge mussels because they were using it for something different. The button industry, by the way, ended especially for 2 reasons. Number one, they overfished the resource to death. In fact, they were bringing mussels from the southeast up the river. Let me read you something here. I try not to read too much to you. But in 1905, Muscatine, Iowa produced 1.5 billion buttons a year. Billion buttons a year. And every year from 1908 to 1920, they estimated 40 to 60 tons of mussel shell was brought into Muscatine alone. Brought into Muscatine alone. I'm going to read you one other thing as I have it pulled here, and we have plenty of time. There was a malacologist, a specialist in mussels, who in 1905 visited Prairie du Chien, an area I know well and love to visit there. Did a lot of nice work there. Prairie du Chien's almost built on mussels, but this malacologist, a specialist named Frank Baker from Illinois, he wrote the book in 1928, Freshwater Mussels in Wisconsin, so he knew our turf. Went up, and this is what he wrote in 1905 from his 1904 visit. The craze for pearls, as well as the more legitimate fishing for pearl bud material, is well nigh exhausted the mussel beds in this region, the Prairie du Chien. The huge piles of mussels on the Wisconsin shore near Prairie du Chien bear silent and potent witness to the fact that mussel fishery in this part of the river has seen its best day. We are told that several years ago, as many as 1,500 boats a year, 1,500 boats were engaged in the mussel fishery, but at the present, only about 100 are engaged in this work. 1,500 boats. The fact is, a lot of this was done for pearls. Some would be sold for buttons if they could, glutted the market finally. But this really stripped and damaged the resource quite badly. I should point out that the pearl button industry ended not only because of the lack of mussel shells, but the advent of plastics during World War II supplanted the freshwater mussel. The freshwater mussels were pretty much badly damaged and scarce. Certain shells were much better than others. They didn't like shells with rough exteriors. They wanted a dense, thick shell, smooth back if they could get it, and one with out-colored nacre. You get nacre that's pink or colored in various ways. They like pure white because they made such a nice lustrous button and nice lustrous pearls. Here we go. This is not very long ago, and they're steaming them open just like they did in the old days. But now they're steaming them open for cultured pearls. Steam open the shells of 3 ridges and washboard mussels, whereas washboards are deep water species. And you can get them with a crowfoot bar pretty easily. There were other ways Historically, I know people that were divers. I know a biologist who was a diver, a scuba diver, and still is. And he paid his way through undergraduate school at Madison diving for mussels in the Mississippi River. And he made a good living doing it. He said you couldn't see anything, you just feel his way along. And he collected lots of mussels, washboards and three-ridge mussels, and they were sold to clam buyers. They were put on barges and taken down river. And this is a washboard, and this is a three-ridge. And they would take these and cut these up and grind these into slugs, spherical slugs. And what do? Them? You insert them in the pearl oyster and leave them there for a period of time. And you take the pearl oyster out of its pearl oyster bed, which are on racks, and you open the oyster and you got your cultured pearl. So if you own a cultured pearl, you have a pearl from the Mississippi River inside, coated with oyster nacre on the outside. Changes in the river. Here I am back in my archaeology at Prairie du Chien. I'll make you look at archaeology again. And these are shell beds that edges of which still exist there. And these can be quite extensive and they're irregular, as you can imagine, but there are about 1,000 years separating these two beds. This is historic over the bank alluvium, post-settlement alluvium over here, but these are buried. We find artifacts in here. We find projectile points and potsherds and fires. We know muskrats don't do those kinds of things. And in these beds, in the Prairie du Chien, the two most common species are the ebony shell, right here, which is gone now, no skipjack herring, and the monkey face. These together, I don't remember exactly, make up about 80% of the mussels. We think that mussels were collected by women and children, certainly during low water period, during the warm season of the year. So mid-late summer, you could get out, the living's easy on the river. Men are doing stuff too, but we think known historically in other parts of the United States, women often were involved. Go out with basketry, and you open basketry, you could fill it up in a foot or 2 feet of water. You can fill up your baskets of mussels, bring them in. You can harvest a lot per hour because I've done it as an experimental basis. I didn't look up today how many you could harvest, but a lot. And people that have fires going, steam them out and take those meats and string them up. It doesn't take very long. It's amazing when you string up mussel meats that it only takes a few days for them to dry out. And I did this a number of times and dried them out, and they lose a lot of moisture right away and they slow down. Interestingly, after the first day, insects and flies don't get on them. They get kind of hard on the outside. They don't seem to be bothered by insects, which one would think they do. But strung up and dried out, they dry out very nicely. So we think there was quite an industry, and sometimes by native peoples harvesting these, lose 85% of their weight. You could basket them up and keep some. And then in the winter, if you had a bad winter or deer hunting wasn't good, you had some freshwater mussels you could grind up, make into that nice stew and have for dinner. I very much am interested, as I said before, in the distribution of past species. And I want to point out this is a species called a purple warty-back here, Cyclonus tuberculata, purple warty-back. And this is where I've gotten them in historic times on the upper Wisconsin River, and gotten them here and here in historic middens. Here are shells that were collected. And here they are in historic times. So we know, even though they're not shown here on the distribution maps, we know their distribution once was much wider spread than it is today. So again, back to my archaeology, I'm interested in where things are, where they were in the past, and what they can tell us about water conditions, and sometimes what it can tell us about the fish that were present. Lastly, not all middens are made by pearlers or Native American peoples, but muskrats. Muskrats are wonderful fishers of freshwater mussels. These are both photographs from Prairie du Chien back when I worked in Prairie back in the 80s, late 70s and 80s. And they like a nice log to sit on. They sit there, they chisel these babies open. You find these nice piles of mussels, and it really gives you a nice sample of what's in the river today, at least in shallow waters. So it's fun to look at these and see what's present. Here you can see these beautiful shells, and there's all kinds of species here. And I won't try to go through them, but there are a variety of species here. And it's so much fun to look at these. Want to point out at this point that today in the state of Wisconsin, it's true to varying degrees in Wisconsin and Iowa and Minnesota, as well as Wisconsin, that you cannot collect live mussels without a special permit from the DNR. All mussel collecting's been stopped. In part due to overfishing, we had not only the mussel fishery to make cultured pearls, but we had people with biological training, I'll put it that way, who went around with scuba divers in small streams like the Yellow River and near here. And they would go in scuba gear and fill up burlap bag after burlap bag of mussels, 100 mussels to the bag, load them on trucks, take them to a supply company. They'd be sold to biological supply companies to send out to students to work on in labs at high schools and universities around the country. Problem was they just took too many. And we've shut down, where DNR, Department of Natural Resources, shut down the mussel fishery. And no one's allowed to take live mussels. You can take some shells of non-endangered or non-threatened mussels, but that's quite reduced now. You can take three-ridge mussels and a few others. DNR has a nice website. Please look on the DNR website, and they will show you which ones can be collected. It's empty shells, it's dead shells. Please don't collect live animals. There are a number of good guides that are available. There's a nice guide for Minnesota. There's one for Missouri. There's one for Wisconsin. You can get a freshwater mussel guide that has photographs and some information. And I suggest you do it if you want to collect shells. Be sure you know what you collect. And there I am, only 45 minutes in. I'm ready for questions. I can. She's speaking.
She's muted. Tell her she's muted.
You're
There I
muted,
am.
Christy.
Thank you. I'm coming back in here. Alrighty here. So I was wondering if you could kind of go in a little bit more depth in how you were introduced to studying mussels.
Well, we found mussels in archaeological sites. I was an undergraduate at the University of Cincinnati, and I worked on the Little Miami River as well as the Ohio River, and we found mussel shells there. And I became interested in the archaeological mussel shells as well as the modern mussel shells, because there were no prohibitions against what you could collect at the time. So I collected mussel shells, and I just kind of put that in my hat, and I had a friend who was interested in mussels. And I went to graduate school and dug shell bins. And from those shell bins, I was perplexed on what some of the species were, because I looked at the modern mussels that I could find along the shore, and those modern mussels didn't look like many of the ones I collected. So I went to the perler bins and collected shells there, and I said, aha, ebony shells and monkey faces. And then I got in contact with two very wonderful people. One was a zooarchaeologist, a biologist in Illinois named Paul W. Parmalee, who became a great friend and a mussel expert and wrote a book on the mussels of Illinois, a very great guy, and Dr. David Stansberry at Ohio State University. And he is one of the top mussel people in the country at the time, and he's both deceased now. But I would send them shells and say, what the heck is this? Or words to those effects. And they would say, oh, this is this, or you're wrong on that. And they would always send other shells back. They said, we have shells. We don't know where they come from, but here's an example. Here's an example. Keep looking. Send us more shells. We'll tell you what they are. Keep some. So I learned by that way and working with Parmalee and Stansberry. and literally became amazed with them. This collected mussels. At the time that I was working, only the Higgins-eye pearly mussel, Lampsilus Higgins-eye, was protected, and the other mussels could be taken and were taken by all kinds of people. And I collected shells and some live mussels, and built a collection, and still do analysis of them. In fact, I'm working on a collection right now from Iowa, from the Des Moines River Valley, because it hasn't been analyzed, and I've done a lot of mussel shells in the last 50 years or so. So it's been a long sequence. I do other weird things too, like fish bones and land snails, but I love freshwater mussels. Freshwater mussels are fascinating. You just think it's a lump on the bottom of the stream. It has this fascinating life history, this interaction with fish, and I don't think they get no respect.
I completely agree. Friendly reminder to our attendees, if you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A function below. I have one here. And exploring the distribution of mussels in the past, how far back is their data?
Well, it depends on where you work. Some areas, the data go back 10,000 years. Most of the stuff I work with is 3,000 years or less. And that's kind of later part of pre-Columbian and pre-European contact native peoples. So we do get shell middens that are 5,000 and 6,000 years old in the southeast, and in Kentucky, especially on the Green River and places like that. They're huge, immense shell middens. And I mean, there are millions and millions of shells. And those go back 5,000 and 6,000 years with abundant shells. It takes good preservation and abundant shells to make a nice picture of what happened in the past, what it looked like. But we do learn a great deal by looking at these. And I find that biologists who work with freshwater mussels and mycologists are always interested. And just so you know, when I analyze shells, the big sites I've analyzed, I always take a set of what I call voucher specimens, and they're an institution. So I say it's a Lampsilus cardium. Well, you can go look at it and see if it is, see if I'm wrong or not. So big collections like Broglie, it had 25 species. All shells all went to Ohio State, all cataloged in there. So various places are cataloged in. At the Archaeology Center and Mississippi Valley Archaeology Center, which I'm a research associate of, and La Crosse is a federal repository, and we keep our shells there. So if people don't trust my IDs, they're welcome to come and look. Because I don't trust people, so I don't trust very many people's identification because it's a tricky business. I didn't go into the nuances, but it can be quite tricky and taxing to get used to the phenotypes or whatever you're looking at and the species variation. Be sure you know what you're looking at.
There is actually a second part to that question. And is there data about how mussel populations were affected by the reversal of the Wisconsin River in the late Cenozoic?
No, not that I know of. I know there's studies on changes in mussel distribution based on presumed reversals in river current, but right now I don't have that information in my head. But no, late Cenozoic, I understand the question, but I don't know the data, if the data exists or not. It may well exist, but I have not worked with that. And sorry, I feel like I should have prepped more. Send me the questions in advance next time.
Okay, well, how about this one? I've heard of zebra mussels showing up in Wisconsin. Are they in Southwest Wisconsin or in the Mississippi?
Oh my God, I'm sorry I didn't mention zebra mussels. Damn zebra mussels, sorry. They're just horrible. Zebra mussels is the last straw on the freshwater mussels. They cover the freshwater mussels. They're an invasive species from Eurasia, as I recall. They're about as large as the end of one's adult thumb. They clog up everything, they reproduce very quickly, and they do keep freshwater mussels from properly closing and opening, and they've resulted in a lot of loss. I'm sorry I didn't mention some of the very tragic ways mussels not only overexploited, sedimented, polluted, and zebra mussels on top of it. So we've had a pretty good population of surviving mussels in the Mississippi River up to the 80s, early 90s. And the Wisconsin River's got some wonderful beds. The Orion bed in the lower Wisconsin River is a wonderful mussel bed. And the one on the Mississippi River is not fared well. And I don't know what the current status is, but it's been tragic what the zebra mussels have done. However, if the water gets warm enough, it kills the zebra mussels. I think we had a big die-off a few years ago when the river, Mississippi River, got too warm. But they're very productive species, and and they're called invasive for a reason. Tragic for the mussels.
You, in your presentation, I believe you mentioned 50 species in the Mississippi River of mussels. Do you know how many mussel species have gone extinct due to either the pearl industry or even the zebra mussels?
No. There are a number of species in the southeastern United States that's gone extinct, and these are kind of riffle species. They're like shallow, riffly water, have not done well. And species we don't have here, I said Mississippi River and its drainages, we have 50 species. Some of these small stream species really are almost never found, except maybe it's an accidental inclusion in the Mississippi proper, like the ellipse shell. But I'm not sure. I'm trying to think if any have gone extinct, but they've gotten very, very rare. So we may not have them in the Mississippi River, but we still have populations of some things like the monkey face mussel in the lower Wisconsin River. So sometimes populations still exist, but they're very rare elsewhere. We have purple wardybacks in the St. Croix, but I've never seen one on the modern Mississippi River. So it has to do with habitat, host fish exploitation, and those darn zebra mussels. God.
Why do you think that mussels didn't become a part of the cuisine of Americans who harvested so many mussels, or did it, and we just don't have well-documented records of it?
There's one case I know. I wish I'd looked this. Ask those questions in advance next time. There's one individual from the late 1800s, early 1900s, I think late 1800s, who came from New England eating mussels, and he said the mussels were just as good as any mussels that they had on the coast. However, people have told me mussels taste like the water they come from. And when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, my committee said, to pass this, you're going to have to eat freshwater mussel. And I went, uh-oh. Because I've been worked on the river, and it doesn't always smell good. Yeah. And so I called or contacted Pam Theler, Dr. Pam Theler, who was a fisheries biologist who worked in Prairie du Chien the same time I did, worked on mussels, and I said, is it healthy for me to eat a freshwater mussel? Please help me. And she said, no, too much mercury, too many concentrate, that they concentrate pesticides, mercury, and other toxins because they live so long. So she says it's not safe to eat. So she saved me from eating a freshwater mussel, and I owe her a meal. If she's listening, I owe her a meal.
Fantastic. Got a couple more. Besides the National Pearl Button Museum in Muscatine, I'm assuming that's how I pronounce that, are you aware of a repository of driftless area-sourced pearls?
No. It's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. By the way, there's an excellent book on the pearl button industry that one can get online, because I looked today, as it's in a series called Images of America. And it's Muscatine's Pearl Button Industry. Muscatine's Pearl Button Industry, published in 2007. Melinda Alexander is the author. But if you put in Muscatine's Pearl Button Industry, and which I did today, I prompted a little bit, and I'll come a lot of copies for sale from offering $15 to $20 to $25. It's a nice book. It's well, if you're interested in pearl buttons, it's a dandy. And they mention pearls in there. And there's also other information and books on pearls, not recent books, but 100-year-old books on pearls that were written. And there's a number of books that one can find and would tell you more about pearls. Is there a repository? Not that I know of, but you check with museums. I know the University of Wisconsin, Madison has an excellent shell collection, as do many institutions, because one of the people that worked there for a while was a diver and made huge, nice, very nice collection. So places like Ohio State Museum, University of Michigan, University of Tennessee might be places to contact, and they may have an expert on staff, or the Field Museum. I guess I'd start with the Field Museum. They have excellent people there, and they would be able to direct you to that.
I think I got like 2 last questions here. Are you aware of how local water chemistry affects the iridescence of nacre? N-A-C-R.
Nacre.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm not. But some shells are more lustrous than others, and that's one reason it was prized. Shells were prized for the shell button industry as well as pearls, because they have beautiful, beautiful lustrous color. And I don't have any idea. I would think any acidic waters would not be good. If you go pretty far north and collect shells in Wisconsin, they're in the far, far north. They're not as lustrous, in my opinion. Different species sometimes, not as lustrous and rich as ours. We're calcium rich, mostly calcium carbonate, and they are quite striking when they're fresh. Beautiful, I think.
And so you showed us examples of Native Americans using mussel shells for tools. Do you have examples of them utilizing mussels in decorative ways?
Yes, it depends on which group we have, but they like mussels for beads sometimes. And I think sometimes they express themselves as very nice spoons and things like that. But beads were not uncommon, made out of mussel shells. I think they took hollow reeds and would take sand and put in the end and grind them out and cut beads out very nice and round. Certain cultural groups like pearls, but other groups seem not to be interested in the pearls they found. So I found pearls in my shell middens and said, "Oh, look, here's a pearl." And didn't think anything of it. So pearls are hard to drill. I think you need special copper tools. At the time, they had to have copper, or some groups had a little bit of meteoric iron that they could have used to drill. But it's a problem. Once you have a pearl, how do you mount it? Guess you could glue it, but it's interesting to me working on shell middens, how few shell tools you find. You find more shell tools away from middens or rock shelters or living sites away from the river where people took shells and they would often modify them for spoons and scrapers and things like that. So not very many ornaments besides beads.
Can shields provide DNA for identification? I'm assuming that's shells.
I'm not sure. I'm not, I would think they might, because they lay down layer after layer after layer, and you would think they would encompass the composition of the water and chemistry. And I'm not sure DNA would be preserved. I would guess I would think not.
Okay. And what can mussels today tell us about the environment of the Mississippi?
Well, today it's damaged, and we've damaged it with locks and dams. And it was a very different world in pre-European times. And we haven't lost everything. We've stepped in where we could, stop pollution. You know, who wants to live downstream in Minneapolis 30 years ago? And because it was a lot of pollution, and below Chicago, the Illinois River was terribly polluted. And some of these areas, mussels come back. Mussel populations that live in very small areas can repopulate if we can control water quality, number one, and number two, invasive species. There's devil zebra mussels out of the picture would help. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but we still have populations that are pretty rich as far as I know. And in some streams, I'm not sure how well the Mississippi's faring since the zebra mussel invasion. And I would work a lot inland these days, so.
Well, I think that wraps up our Q&A portion of this presentation. Is there any way able to contact you or anything like that? People to reach out to you if they have additional questions?
They can get my email through the Mississippi Valley Archaeology Center at UW-La Crosse.
Okay.
I can give it, or you have it.
Yeah, we'll be able to provide that.
If they have a question, they can send me an email. I will try to answer it. I'll do my best. Those are good questions. Next time I'll have to answer all questions in advance. No, I'm just kidding. Thanks, everybody. It's been great.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Theler, for joining us today, and we really appreciate you giving this presentation.
Thank you. I thank you and Susanna Harris, my partner, for helping saving me from embarrassment.
All right. Well, I think that's about going to wrap it up for today. So thank you so much for joining our winter Lyceum presentation, and hope you guys have a good rest of your week.
Thank you. Watch out for the time change.
Watch out. Yes. Yeah. Have a good rest of your day, guys.
Bye.